Okay, so those examples should give an idea of the type of thing that I'm shooting for and why I developed this method. The term isochronal asymmetry is formal terminology denoting unevenly subdivided beat cells that recur at a fixed tempo, or in other words, regular unevenness. A ubiquitous traditional example would be the shuffle rhythm, where the written eighth notes are interpreted as shuffled or swung eighth notes with triplet partials in each quarter note beat grouped 2 and 1. In shuffles, this tripletized phrasing recalibrates symmetrical duplets to a new asymmetric grid of swung duplets. In other words, when swung, pairs of written straight eighth notes have traditionally been interpreted and played as the first and third partials of an eighth note triplet. And you can see figure 1 has represented the notation for that transformation there. More recently, drum programmers working in popular electronic forms such as rap, drum and bass, hip-hop, neo-soul, and associated subgenres have utilized digital technology to finesse the microtiming of swung rhythms, either by manipulating the degree of swing applied to straight subdivisions or by regridding the metric infrastructure altogether, recalibrating it to a subdivision of primary pulse other than the commonplace 2, 3, or 4-note groupings, such as quintuplets or septuplets, for example. There's a representation of that, 4 different ways of conceptualizing a duplet. Microtiming possibilities for digitally manipulating subdivisions exploited by electronic programmers are increasingly reflected in the live performance of the prominent drummers developing ways to humanly reverse engineer electronically generated microtimings. My term, isochronous asymmetry, refers to the lopsided regularity that seems central to a new kind of rhythmic vernacular emerging in contemporary drumming. The main future research idea that emerged from my PhD thesis was based on my own felt need for a practical method of cultivating asymmetric timekeeping grooves. For my purposes, this meant designing a personal pedagogy of technical drills and phrasing exercises that would integrate sticking patterns and hand-foot coordination with rhythmic reading materials, starting with drum set grooves where the straight eighth note upbeats are calibrated to quintuplet or septuplet subdivision grids. In this thesis, I conceptualized this as a referent-analog relationship. Referent and analog, I begin by taking a basic eighth note dance groove as my referent. This ubiquitous duplet-based beat, as you see in figure 3, is a standard 4/4 timekeeping pattern in which the hi-hat plays even eighth notes to delineate a symmetrical grid of duple subdivisions with a count of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. The bass drum plays on beats 1 and 3, with snare drum backbeats on beats 2 and 4. The same beat can be reproduced as an analog that preserves the patterning sequence of the original while recalibrating its timing to an asymmetrical new virtual grid of uneven duplets in long-short sequence, long, short, long, like that, based on quintuplets or septuplets. And you see that in the notation. This is the blue text is straight from the PhD. The virtual gridding that underpins these recalibrated analogues is designated as either long-short quintuplet or long-short septuplet format. Both recalibrations effectively transplant the referent from its original context without altering either its compositional sequence or its functional ontology as a basic dance groove. In both analogues, bass drum and snare drum patterning retain their original relation to the primary quarter note pulse, while the eighth note hi-hat upbeat, that is the and of each count, is displaced to the fourth quintuplet partial in figure 4 and the fifth septuplet partial in figure 5, in those figures. Throughout, the count of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and remains embedded with the pattern as it is transplanted from its actual grid to the new virtual grid. In other words, the count travels with the patterning, as does the tempo. However, while a recalibrated analog retains the quarter note pulse of its original referent, the main difference is that symmetrically gridded referent subdivisions generate a discrete parallel pulse, whereas asymmetrically gridded analogs express rhythm comprising long and short notes rather than isochronous pulsations. So there's a difference between a rhythm and a pulse. Theoretical rhythmic consequences unfolding from quintuplet and septuplet-based interplay between grid, pulse, and function, especially in relation to how the numerical ratios involved implicitly facilitate modulations that reorient our perception of pulse, are no different in principle than those that would arise from recalibrating an eighth-note referent to the triplet-based shuffle grid. That is, the resulting shift changes a straight eighth-note pulse into a long-short duple rhythm, so from a pulse to a rhythm. However, triplet gridded rhythms are already long-standing archetypes in Western popular music, deeply embedded in jazz drumming culture and its associated pedagogy, whereas popular rhythmic expressions based on the conscious manipulation of quintuplet and septuplet subdivisions constitute elements of a relatively new emerging vernacular. The following procedures show how traditional staples of Western rhythmic vernacular underpinning my own drumming idiolect, namely duple, triple, and quadruple groupings, can be integrated with a new asymmetrically gridded timekeeping format. This idea has been translated by me into a practical workbook package that includes demonstration sound files of the exercises and play-along backing tracks with MIDI keyboard and bass accompaniment for the source reading materials. The basics of the method. The book is divided into two sections. Part 1 is 5-tup mode or quintuplet mode. Part 2 is 7-tup or septuplet mode. The method for both sections follows the same steps based on 3 concepts: pivot, frame, and axis. I'll explain those. The pivot concept. The workbook outlines a method for dealing with mechanics and phraseology in quintuplet and septuplet rates based on funk, pop, R&B timekeeping. The exercises, comprised of various 2/4 and 4/4 patterns and source reading materials, are designed to develop the concept of pivot groupings in each 5-tup or 7-tup beat cell, organised as follows. So you see the relation there of quintuplet, it's like 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3, and then the 7-tuplet is 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 1 2 3 4, and then the B pivot in 5 is 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2, and in 7 is 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 1 2 3. The next concept is the frame, and that's based on the pivot. A frame is a simple 3 or 4 note device based on the pivot and offers a mechanically and functionally familiar point of entry to 5-tup and 7-tup backbeat grooving for the player whose funk timekeeping is already habituated to triplet 8th and 16th note music, which is what my playing is. They are applied here as recurring 2-beat hi-hat patterns with snare drum backbeats. You see the notation here. In the book, 5-tup frames, 5A and 5B in part 1, are rhythms comprised of 3 notes per beat, 2 pivot hits plus 1 extra note, as follows. As you see on the bottom line, the frame is ding ding da ding ding da ding ding da ding ding, or ding da ding ding da ding ding da ding ding da ding. The 7-tup frames, part 2, are comprised of 4 notes per beat, 2 pivot hits, plus 2 extra notes as follows: ding da ding 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 da ding 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 da ding 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 da ding ding, or ding 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 da ding 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 da ding 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 da ding. So that's those frames are just basic, like a starting point, an easy handhold to get a relatable grasp on this approach. So it doesn't become too mathematical and too nerdy too soon, because the mathematics of this stuff balloons out very quickly, and you can start doing too much computing. So I was looking for something that's very immediate and relatable, that comported with what I've always played all my life, and the same books that I've studied out of, and what most drummers and musicians and fans of music are familiar with, same sorts of structures. The third concept here for a drum set application is the concept of the axis. And this is basically, an axis frame has a 5-to-2 or a 7-to-2 ratio. So it's going over 2 beats now. That ratio to the single beat cells we've explored so far. Axis 1 begins on beat 1, crosses beat 2, and resolves back on beat 1. Axis 2 is the same figure displaced by 1/16th note tuplet partial. This effectively amounts to a group of 5 or 7 notes beginning on beat 2, crossing beat 1, and resolving back to beat 2. These rhythms combine with snare drum backbeats on beat 2 to form the following composite frame rhythms. So you see that, the axis is on the top line, and the sort of like the frame rhythm is on the bottom line. It's the same thing, but just playing 5/2 beats and then displacing that. It's still 5/2 beats, but resolving to beat 2 in axis 2. And it's the same for 5 and 7. It's the same concept, but you just get, you end up with like a pulse of actually a pulse of 5 and a pulse of 7. So you can modulate to those time signatures doing that as well. Bisection and alignment, because of the ratios involved, axis 1 structures are always bisected at their mathematical midpoint by a system backbeat on 2. Conversely, the displacement of axis 2 structures means these axes and systems always align together at beat 2. That is, in unison with the system backbeat as follows. And you see the relationship there, like for the drumming coordination, where the hands line up and where they form splits. So that's part of the sort of the mechanics of the method for drummers specifically. And it's basically, you know, starts with that mechanical relationship of the hands to give you a functioning backbeat, kind of like an archetype or just a frame of reference that all the phrasing can fit around. Just like normal rock drumming, most drummers start with, you know, the typical kind of rock beat pattern. This is just another way of approaching, like a point of entry for dealing with you know, polyrhythmic and odd subdivisions, but that is very relatable because it has a backbeat to it, and it's a very fixed kind of starting point, and then you start methodically stepping through ways to include different phrasing on your other limb, like on your kick drum, around this framework. With the pivot and frame and axis structures established, the method that follows is based on adapting these patterns into various hi-hat, snare, drum orchestrations coordinated with the following 3 modes of kick drum phrasing. Either unison, so that in a unison the kick drum lands exactly with part of the frame all the time. The so-called splits is where the kick drum falls in between the frame in a linear fashion, and then combos are where it's partly landing together with the frame and partly in between the hi-hat or the cymbal or the snare drum on the frame. Here's some examples of me playing that kind of concept. This is basically the 5/A frame, tick, 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 and also the access, tick, 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 on the hi-hat with the snare drum backbeat, and reading off source reading material on the kick drum. And this should have a backing track to it. And then I do it, yeah, the first way is the frame way, then the axis way, and then the third way is what I call embellishments, where you start putting in paradiddle combinations and ghosted notes in and around the frames. It sounds like this. Now here's the same thing with the embellishments. Here's another example. Now with the axis. Okay, again, reading from the PhD, the proposed framework is not an attempt to somehow reify transgressive rhythmic behaviours. It is intended as a logical extension of metric ideas emerging from this research project, having been prompted by changes in popular rhythm culture and the recognition that practical drum set pedagogies addressing this area have yet to be fully developed. Now, I wrote that in 2016. At the time, there were actually some things that I didn't know about, and they've since become much better known. I'll mention those. But apart from work by Simon Barker, who has a coherent framework in place for integrating tuplet gridded patterning with conventional even meter grooves, and Aaron Edgar, whose recent installment in Modern Drummer magazine, in a series of short instructional videos published online by Modern Drummer magazine, offers a systematic point of entry to this concept. A comprehensive pedagogical exploration has yet to emerge. It's since, I think that there's much more material available now. Jeff Porcaro's observation that the two basic grooves in contemporary music are your straight eighth notes and 16th note groove, and your shuffle groove, which is derived from triplets, remains broadly true nearly 30 years later. Drummers still play these grooves, if only as a matter of commercial viability, prioritising orthodoxy over transgressive ideas with less immediate application. However, the orthodoxy itself is also changing. Marcus Gilmore, Amir Questlove-Thompson and Chris Daddy Dave, all of whom successfully deploy micro-timed approaches to time functioning that might formerly have been marginalised as heterodox, are now among the most celebrated and critically acclaimed drummers in American music. Furthermore, the fact that contemporary pop dance music increasingly exploits digitally or humanly manipulated microtiming of commonplace rhythms, thereby generating the lopsided groove concept I have termed isochronal asymmetry, itself represents a significant departure from the uniformity and metrical symmetry that characterised drum set orthodoxy and commercial studio protocols for pop dance recordings in Porcaro's era, and the era that I grew up in. Everything was even. Straight eighth notes, and that duplet pulse was actually a tempo in itself. That's kind of changed now. You have this. It's kind of lopsided. So I wanted a method for developing that. And this kind of came out of this PhD study as a future research goal, and then I developed it into this easy book. The evident paradigm shift underway in popular rhythm culture that increasingly compels drummers and others to humanly emulate or reverse engineer asymmetrically programmed microtiming could also inform a corresponding revision of instructional methodology that cultivates danceable grooves based on microstructures other than 2, 3, and 4 subdivisions, thereby recalibrating technical and phraseological systems of an outdated musical economy. The tuplet-based phraseology I envisage would recalibrate time functioning, rudiments, independence, and syncopation, effectively grafting tuplet analogues of vernacular beat archetypes into commonplace metrical infrastructure. Afterward. In the years since starting to develop this book in 2019, I have discovered 3 pedagogical methods that overlap somewhat with my approach, namely collapsed rudiments, Klaus Hassler, morphing by Gordy Knudsen, that should have a T, Knudtsen, and swag drumming by Jan Pfennig. Although I developed my system completely independently of these educators, mostly influenced by a desire to apply some of Simon Barker's idea to my own context by developing a method that followed the same steps as the conventional popular drum books I grew up studying. The initial impulse was to develop a method just for myself to address specific technical and conceptual shortcomings I was aware of in my own playing. It was never intended for publication, but the response I received in 2019 when presenting some of this material at 2 European institutions and from numerous online drum students in different countries has persuaded me that other drummers are also interested in a simple and methodical way of developing the concept. So I set about redesigning the original private draft for public consumption. And there's references there for those of you who are interested in that type of thing. So that's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Andy. That was fantastic. Do we have any questions?